absolutely.
Moving on to something lighter now, Tom, although fascinating, and something that back when I was teaching many, many years ago, I used to show this when we talked about the philosophy of ethics, and we talked about morality, and we talked about understanding empathy. And that's the idea that some people prefer animals to people. And it's a long-going discussion, a long-going debate, and it does help us to understand as well why so many people now are becoming more and more resistant to empathy towards others in their species, and actually are much more empathetic towards other species. And I want to just pull up this article that Dorset Eyes published today. And the article, it's a wonderful article, I think, in terms of explaining the theories behind, psychologically, sociologically, criminologically, helping us to understand what it is about other parts of our species, other aspects of our species, that we become more and more inclined to not understand their feelings. And we've gone more inclined to be attracted purely to vulnerability, but vulnerability that has been classified for us. But before we do, can I just show this clip? And it's from America, from the US, and they've had decades and decades of, I guess because of their politics in such a way, in terms of the way in which they're set up through their constitution, but decades and decades of putting the animal first for many people in America. And just like, we're used to walking around wherever we live and coming across human cemeteries, you're just as likely in different parts of the United States to walk around and come across pet cemeteries. And because I'm not referring to the Stephen King novel, I'm referring to actual cemeteries where people with money, people who have had an emotional attachment to their pets, to a range of animals, have treated them exactly the same way as humans when they've died. This is just one very, very short clip. This is a police dog. Okay, this is a police dog. The resting place of a local hero.
It was very recently, actually. There was a police dog named Patriot. He was the first canine dog in the canine police unit, and I don't think any of us really expected, or anticipated the amount of people that came.
At least like 30 dogs,
yeah.
And over 100 people.
There was bagpipers. There was a gun salute.
They sat at attention while Patriot was being buried. It really was magnificent.
When they lowered the casket, each handler that came with his dog brought the dog past the gravesite. Each dog would bark as he walked by and gave respect to the police dog that had died.
Unfortunately, there still are an awful lot of people who don't understand this, who think that this is kind of a silly thing to do. A lot of people stereotype, probably the people who bury pet are elderly women who probably don't have any children of their own, and these are substitute children. Nothing could be further than true.
Sometimes people will say, after they've done the burial, they'll say, "You must think I'm crazy." And usually what we say to them is, well, this cemetery's been here since 1896, and there's over 70,000 pets that are buried here. So there's a lot of crazy people out there then too. We're all in good company.
The pets are part of their family. This is a place where their pets can be safe. That's the most important thing that we do here.
Evocative.
It's not for us, Tom, is it, to say this is right or wrong. What we're trying to do is just bring it to people's attention and trying to explain. We'll come back to the article in a moment. Just trying to explain why this is the case.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, you know, America can be a little fanatical about things, you know, even more so than in this country. Yeah, I didn't actually realise that there was, you know, so many of these pet cemeteries, but across America, but extraordinary, really. And I'm not surprised though about that particular. You know, his name was Patriot. You know, the dog's name was Patriot. You know, he's got, obviously had a Stars and Stripes collar, and you know, went on social media and owned the libs on a regular basis. So you know, no doubt very popular. Bless. So yeah, I mean, clearly people. There's nothing wrong, obviously, with people loving animals and loving their pets. It's quite right that people love animals. We should love animals and not want animals to be mistreated, including in our food production processes, apart from other things. You know, Britain is known as a nation of pet lovers. You know, we love our pets, dogs and cats particularly, but all pets. And it's great that young people, you know, that children develop empathy and taking care of others through having pets and so forth, and that people love, you know, have a love of animals and of nature. All of that is really positive and really healthy. Where it starts to get questionable and interesting, looking at why, like that article looks at why this is. It starts to get questionable when perhaps our empathy towards other human beings is not as much as it might be towards animals.
If I could just interject here, interestingly, yeah. The study that in the article that we published, what it did was it looked at 4 categories. It looked at adult humans, and it looked at young infants. It looked at adult animals, and it looked at, for want of a better word, in terms of, let's say, dogs, puppies. It then did its psychological research across all 4. Now, guess which one came bottom?
The adults.
Adult humans.
Adult humans. Sorry,
all the rest were much of a muchness. The adult animal, the puppy, and the infant. Pretty much of a muchness. No real difference. But the standout was the adult human. Now, I guess we could explain that in that we tend to relate our understanding to those closest to us. So we make sense of our reality by the people that walk by our window, the people that we walk by in the street. And we then associate those people as being, however we might associate them philosophically, we associate them as being atomized individuals who have the capacity to look after themselves. Whereas the dog, the puppy, and the infant are perceived, especially in domesticated cases, are perceived to be much more vulnerable. So there is a core rationale that can be used here to help us to understand why it is that we have less empathy and less consideration for that outlier, i.e. the adult.
Yeah. And it's a reasonable thing, I suggest, that people feel more empathy for the vulnerable. You know, in those 4 examples, the adult human is regarded as less vulnerable than the other 3 categories, because supposedly, you know, the adult human's more able to fend for themselves and look after themselves and fight back for themselves and what have you, compared to the animals, the puppies, the infants, etc. And that's quite reasonable that we empathise and feel sympathy more for those who are regarded as vulnerable. But arguably, there are vulnerable human beings of all ages who we're less inclined these days to feel empathy for.
Right,
for
can
example,
I just come back in, Tom? So I can just come back there. If we make this a to and fro, because it'd be really, really useful here. The thing about the adult, though, is that we've been conditioned to believe in terms of free will. So we've been conditioned to believe with individualism, economically and politically, that all individuals are capable of making rational decisions. So the responsibility isn't upon the population when we say, hang on a minute, you're showing less empathy and less consideration for really vulnerable adults, because ultimately they've been conditioned in the last 40, 50 years, especially, to believe that those individual adults are where they are because of their own decision making. That is where the major, if you want to call it this, failing exists in the social conditioning of people, especially in Western societies, to believe that responsibility solely lies with the person who's in that position. So if you're extremely rich, you deserve to be, and if you're extremely poor, you deserve to be.
Absolutely right, Jason. That you know, decades of social conditioning of the public to believe that you know that wherever we are in life, wherever we get to, is that we have a truly meritocratic and fair society, and you get wherever you deserve to be based on your abilities, your intelligence, and your application, your hard work. That everything is based on those things, as opposed to, you know, the structural inequalities that exist in society, you know, levels of advantage or disadvantage that people are born into, the uneven, not at all level playing field that exists. You know, those things are real, but we've been conditioned over decades to not believe that those things have much effect or any at all, and that it's all down to the individual. And that conditioning has been a massive successful program of brainwashing by the mega rich that benefit from all the inequalities, all the structural inequalities and the uneven playground and the privilege that exists, the advantage and the disadvantage that exists in society, to have convinced most of the public that those things aren't relevant, and that, you know, you get wherever you end up through hard work and through individual characteristics or whatever, is a massive success for the most privileged, the most wealthy, the most powerful, and it helps enable them to retain the status quo and retain that wealth and power. I was just going to mention, you know, in terms of the vulnerable. Great that we empathise with the vulnerable, but again, I'd suggest that many people have been conditioned to have less empathy for certain types of vulnerable people with brown skin, people that are refugees, people that are asylum seekers, people that claim benefits, single parents, single mothers, the homeless, etc., etc. And some of that leads to the kind of vitriolic hate that we regularly see on social media, the kind of hate crimes that have been on the rise for a long time against certain people within society, certain human beings, and also government policy. You know, there's no way that Priti Patel as Home Secretary and Johnson as Prime Minister would be introducing draconian, anti-human laws clamping down on people's rights without decades of you know, brainwashing of people to have less empathy for certain human beings. That enables them to introduce fascist policies that we're seeing now.
Yes, I totally agree. And I think also that the humans have a criminal justice system to protect them, whereas animals don't have that. So I think humans can be quite discerning in understanding that we already have a system in place for prosecution and justice for our species. But Animals don't. I mean, obviously, there's lots of discrepancies as well. I mean, if you knock a dog down in a car, you have to report it to the police. If you knock a cat over or down, you don't. So humans have already decided a vertical hierarchy of importance, let's say between a dog and a cat. And again, you know, that sinks into the human psyche. So there's a whole range of characteristics and a whole range of reasons that help to explain this. And I think ultimately what you've just talked about in relation to social conditioning is right there at the forefront. But it's also interesting in that we have, and you mentioned this earlier, and I think this is a really, really important place probably to finish off on, is we have this so-called empathy for animals in relation to adults, puppies, and vulnerable children. And yet we eat them and we allow them to be terrorized, animals, to be terrorized. One of the smartest animals on the planet, believe it or not, is the pig. We terrorize the pig day in, day out. We terrorize sheep, we terrorize cows. I mean, we're talking in this country. You go across to other cultures and, they terrorize reptiles. We terrorized, or we have over time, we've terrorized large cats. We've terrorized elephants. And yet the argument is that some human beings have a lot more sympathy for animals than they do for humans. When in actual fact, when you look at the evidence, there are a lot of humans who are terrorizing animals and people, and usually they have a large amount of power and wealth behind them, and we've elevated them as humans to the top end of society. And what we're also finding with this individualism and this bombardment of victim blaming over the last 40 or 50 years, and we maybe look at this in another episode, is the significant increase in the number of people who are psychopathic and sociopathic. And yet again, we also tend to find they are much more disproportionately part of the elite, the establishment, the decision makers, than across the rest of society.
I was going to joke and say including the Prime Minister and most of his cabinet, but yeah, you're right.
And it's a very, very sad indictment of how, not of the individual atomized humans, because as we've already said, they're as much victims of all this propaganda and conditioning, but it's a sad indictment that we have no opportunities, or very small opportunities, to do anything about it. Once we know, if the rational argument exists, as we talked about earlier, if the argument exists that people believe that we are all rational human beings, surely once you give those people the information, they are then able to change their minds, change their opinions, change their behavior. But to call somebody a rational human being, give them information, and yet they still continued on the same path as they were before they knew this information, that suggests to me that society is largely irrational. And many of the people in it, their day-to-day behaviors are irrational. Great discussion, that, Tom, and I think it's something we're going to come back to in various modes.